What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here. Welcome to day 121 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about another sword and sorcery barbarian character created by Robert E. Howard. This is Kull, the Shadow Kingdom. This is a 6-issue miniseries from Dark Horse Comics by Arvid Nelson with art by Will Conrad and Jose Villarrubia. And this is the story of Kull. He conquers the kingdom of Valusia, and then he has to deal with political conflict from within and an oncoming war with the serpent cult from without. And this story is very similar to a couple of the other Conan stories that I talked about recently, where Conan recently has become the king of a nation, and then he has to deal with problems of being a king as opposed to dealing with problems of being a barbarian. This is very similar to that, and the foreword of this book actually acknowledges how Kull and Conan are kind of sort of the same character, but at the same time they're also very different characters. Allegedly, Robert E. Howard, who's the creator of both of these characters, he wrote a story with Kull from Atlantis, and then he submitted his story to be put in a magazine, I think, and then they said, no, we don't like this story, so he rewrote the story by changing the character's name to Conan, and then they said, yeah, we like this story. And so these characters both basically started off as the same character, but as they mention in the foreword, they also have very different character arcs. Kull of Atlantis, he has a very different journey that he goes on than Conan does. With Conan, he basically, you could just jump in at any point in his life and you could tell a story where he's a pirate or where he's a barbarian or where he's a soldier or maybe where he's a king like you got to see in the movies. With Kull, from the beginning, he was intended to eventually become the king. And in the foreword, they even talk about how the Arnold movies are basically Kull movies that they just called Conan. And they talk about how the serpent cult was never a thing in the Conan stories, but it was a thing in the Kull stories. And that's why we have the serpent cult here, and that's also something in the Arnold stories. And so they talk about how these characters, while they started off as the same character, they both became very different characters. And so if you were looking at this video and you were saying, I really like Conan the Barbarian, but why should I read stories about a character who is basically exactly the same as Conan the Barbarian? This isn't exactly the same as Conan. Reading this series, it's very clear that at least these creators, I don't know about Robert E. Howard, maybe he handled the character just the same as Conan, but these creators, they're handling this character differently than how they would handle Conan. I feel like Kull is a little bit more politically savvy than Conan is. Reading some of these stories where Conan ascends to the throne of a kingdom, it basically seems like as soon as he sits down on the throne, he's bored and he wants to go back to being a barbarian. Here, Kull, from the beginning, he knows what he's doing, or at least he has a pretty good idea what he's doing. There's one thing that happens very early in the story that is against what Kull wants, and he knows that if this thing happens, it is going to make him being a king much more difficult. It's going to make his job of being a king much more difficult, and the people are going to resist him that much more. And seeing that scene play out in this book, I could not imagine Conan actually being that aware of what was going to happen if this thing would happen. I feel like this character, he's a lot more crude, not necessarily crude, he's shrewd. That's the word I'm looking for. It rhymes with crude. He's a lot more clever about how he's doing all this stuff. It's very interesting to see this character who is cut from the same cloth as Conan. Wow. Cut from the same cloth as Conan, but at the same time, he's a very different kind of character. He is not exactly the same character, which is what I had always heard before I read this story. I really like this story. If you like Conan the Barbarian and you've never read anything about Kull from Atlantis, I would suggest that you read this because he is very similar to Conan, but at the same time, he's different enough that if you don't want a Conan ripoff, which is funny because he actually precedes the character of Conan, but if you don't want a character who's exactly like Conan, you're going to be happy. But if you want a character who is similar enough to Conan that if you like that and you want more, you're also going to be happy. I can't imagine anyone not being happy coming away from this book unless you just don't like sword and sorcery barbarian stories. So overall, I would definitely check out Kull, the Shadow Kingdom. Really, my only complaint about this, it's something that I've talked about a few times with some of these sword and sorcery stories. This is way too long. It's 6 issues. It could have been 4. The first issue is him conquering the kingdom. At least all those other Conan stories where he's the new king, they start with him already being the king. I think they could have done that here. The second issue, he finds out that there's a serpent cult and he's going to have to fight them. The plot here is very, very slow, but it is a good plot. I just think that it could have moved quite a bit faster. I think that this could have been a 4-issue miniseries instead of a 6-issue miniseries. But really, that's my only complaint, and it's not a bad thing. I do think that it bothers me more than it would probably bother other people. But that's my thoughts on Kull, the Shadow Kingdom. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and I will be back tomorrow with a different video. In the meantime, you guys have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.